June 6, 1944. Normandy coast. The world was still half asleep when Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Bretz adjusted the dials of his Zeiss rangefinder inside the observation post at Crisbecq battery. He had been awake all night, listening to the distant hum of engines in the dark, brushing it off his nerves. But as the first gray light of dawn crept over the channel, his doubt turned to dread. At first, the horizon seemed blurred as if a fog bank was rolling in. Yet the fog didn't shift with the wind, it grew sharper, harder, until Bretz realized what he was actually seeing. Row after row of dark silhouettes, stretching farther than his eye could follow. The sea itself appeared to have turned to iron. He counted instinctively 1, 2, 10, 20, then gave up. There was no number that could capture this sight. In every direction ships, warships, transports, landing craft, merged into one unbroken mass. The English Channel, once Germany's protective moat, had been transformed overnight into a highway of steel and fire. The radio crackled with reports from other posts along the coast. Some officers claimed hundreds of ships. Others insisted thousands. Bretz's hand trembled as he adjusted his binoculars again. The truth was worse than any report. He was not looking at a raid or even an invasion in the old sense of the word. He was staring at an avalanche. 4 years, Nazi propaganda had promised him that America was a hollow power, a nation of consumers unfit for war. Bretz had believed it at least partly. But now, as he gazed upon the unimaginable, he felt the first crack in that illusion. Weak nations do not build 7,000 ships. The invasion fleet was moving steadily, 8 knots across the gray water. Somewhere out there, Bretz knew, cruisers and battleships were preparing to unleash their broadsides. And beyond them, an air force waiting for daylight to finish what the guns began. Inside the bunker, a fellow officer muttered, "It looks endless." Bretz didn't answer. He felt as though he were witnessing the future taking shape in front of him, and it was not German. The order to prepare for fire came down the line. The crews scrambled to their guns, massive check-made cannons hidden in reinforced concrete. Bretz had trained for this moment, yet a hollow weight settled in his chest. His guns could throw steel across miles of water, but against the sea of ships, what did it matter? Drops of rain against a flood. When he lifted his rangefinder again, the armada had advanced closer, filling the channel with its terrible silence. Bretz thought of his family back in Kiel, of the stories he would never get to tell them. What he saw now would not be forgotten in a lifetime. This was not just an invasion. It was the visible form of industrial might, advancing across the water like destiny itself. The hands on Bretz's wristwatch crept toward 5:30 a.m. The light of dawn had fully broken now, pulling the channel out of its murky half-darkness. What he saw through his binoculars made his throat tighten. The Allied fleet was no longer a blur on the horizon. It was near enough that he could make out individual shapes, the heavy silhouettes of battleships, the slender destroyers slicing the water, the stubby landing craft packed tight as ants on a trail. The order came down the line, "Battery Crisbecq, prepare to fire." The men leapt into motion. Steel doors clanged open, ammunition hoists clattered, and the great 210mm check-made Skoda guns began to rise into position. Bretz barked the range coordinates, his voice steadier than he felt. At 5:55 a.m. the first gun thundered. The bunker shook with the concussion, dust spilling from the seams of the concrete ceiling. Seconds later another cannon spoke, then another. The shells arced high, disappearing into the morning haze before plunging toward the fleet. Bretz pressed his rangefinder tight against his eyes, searching. He saw the geysers of water erupt near a cruiser, close but not close enough. The ships didn't falter. They moved steadily forward, indifferent, like gods striding across the sea. More rounds followed. The men loaded and fired, sweat running down their faces despite the morning chill. Bretz's ears rang, but he kept adjusting the coordinates, urging them to fire faster, harder. Finally, a hit. A plume of black smoke climbed skyward from one of the destroyers. Moments later, a lookout shouted, "She's burning. She's hit." The USS Corey, a sleek American destroyer, had taken a fatal wound. Through his lenses, Bretz could see her bow lifting unnaturally, the stern sliding down into the water. Tiny figures scrambled across the deck as the sea claimed her. For an instant, a thrill of triumph surged through him. The battery had drawn blood. The mighty invasion fleet was not untouchable. Men shouted with renewed energy, loading faster, aiming truer. But the thrill faded as quickly as it had come. Bretz lifted his binoculars again. The sinking destroyer was already being abandoned, her sister ships moving seamlessly into formation as if nothing had happened. Dozens, no hundreds, of others pressed on undisturbed. For every vessel they crippled, 100 more advanced. The channel had become a living thing. The destroyers darted back and forth, shielding the larger transports. Behind them, the battleships loomed like black fortresses, their turrets already beginning to turn. Bretz felt the hairs on his neck rise. He knew what was coming. At 6 a.m. the Allied guns opened fire. The first salvo came from USS Nevada. The battleship's 14-inch guns roared across the water, and an instant later the earth itself seemed to convulse. The shell landed close, too close. The shockwave rattled the observation post, sending cracks spidering across the concrete. Men ducked instinctively as dust and fragments rained down from above. Another thunderclap. Then another. It was as if the horizon itself had erupted. Bretz had trained as an artillery officer, but nothing in his experience prepared him for the fury of naval guns. Each shell weighed as much as a small car, and they came in relentless rhythm. The battery fired back, stubbornly, desperately. The Skoda cannons spat their shells into the gray morning. The crews shouted over the roar, their hands blistered from the work. Bretz called corrections, trying to find weaknesses, trying to make each shot count. But against that vast armada, each strike was meaningless. Drops of fire flung against a storm. The Americans adjusted quickly. Their salvos walked closer with every minute, bracketing the battery. A direct hit smashed into one of the gun emplacements. The explosion sent steel fragments and human cries ripping through the bunker. Smoke filled the chamber, choking, blinding. Men dragged the wounded out as others tried to smother the flames. Bretz coughed hard, his lungs burning. His ears rang so badly that he could hardly hear his own voice as he tried to rally the men. Another impact tore open a section of the bunker, daylight streaming through a ragged hole. And still the ships came. Through the chaos, Bretz forced himself back to the rangefinder. The fleet was closer now, methodical in its advance. He could see landing craft pouring from the bellies of larger ships, lines of them heading for the beaches. The invasion had truly begun. He lowered the binoculars and stared at the scene with naked eyes. The channel seemed alive with motion, ships surging forward, guns blazing, smoke curling into the sky. It was not a battle, he realized. It was a tide. A voice behind him, cracked with fear, whispered, "Herr Oberleutnant, how do we stop this?" Bretz had no answer. His training, his loyalty, his belief in German strength, none of it offered a solution. He could only watch as the weight of an entire world bore down on him. By 6:30 a.m., the beaches were already under fire from both sides. The Americans were coming ashore. The German defenders, stunned by the bombardment, clung to their positions, waiting for the storm to reach them. Bretz wiped the grime from his eyes, swallowed against the dryness in his throat, and whispered to himself, "We are not ready for this. No one could be ready for this." The battle for Normandy had begun, and already he sensed the truth that none of his superiors dared admit: it could not be stopped. Long before Bretz sighted the armada at dawn, the invasion had already begun in the skies above Normandy. At 1:20 a.m., alarms rippled across the 7th Army sector. Reports came in fragmented, frantic. Parachutes over St. Mary-Glisse, more over Corentin, still more near the marshlands of the Cotentin Peninsula. German telephones rang without pause as headquarters tried to piece together the pattern. To the defenders, it felt like chaos descending from the heavens. The truth was staggering. In the darkness, more than 800 Douglas C-47 Skitrans had thundered across the channel, engines droning in endless formation. They carried the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, over 13,000 American paratroopers dropping into the night. To the civilians below, it seemed as though the sky itself was shedding soldiers. In a farmhouse near St. Lo, Hauptmann Dieter Schaefer, commanding a small reserve battalion, was jolted awake by the sound of aircraft overhead. He stumbled outside, pulling his coat around him, and looked up into a sky alive with light. Flares drifted lazily, tracer fire streaked upward, and white parachutes blossomed against the blackness. For an instant he thought he was dreaming. The scale was too vast, too surreal. Men floated down in every direction, rifles strapped to their sides, equipment crates dropping beside them. The fields and hedgerows of Normandy, so quiet hours before, had become a battlefield in the making. "Herr Hauptmann, what are your orders?" one of his lieutenants demanded, panic in his voice. Schaefer clenched his jaw. His orders? He had none. No one had expected this, not here, not now. For weeks, the High Command had insisted the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Normandy was supposed to be secondary, a diversion at most. And yet here it was, thousands of Americans spilling into the night. The paratroopers landed in confusion, many scattered miles from their intended drop zones. Some drowned in the flooded fields deliberately prepared by the Germans. Others dropped into towns still held by enemy troops. But what they lacked in precision they made up for in sheer audacity. Small groups rallied quickly, seizing crossroads, ambushing convoys, cutting telephone lines. By 2 a.m. Schaefer's battalion was already under attack. Shots cracked in the darkness, muzzle flashes flared in the hedgerows. American voices shouted orders in the night, followed by the thump of grenades. Schaefer's men fired wildly, often at shadows, unsure of where the enemy was or how many of them there might be. One soldier, barely 20, whispered, "They're everywhere." He wasn't wrong. From Army Group B headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, listened as the report stacked higher and higher. Parachutes near Saint-Mère-Église. Firefights in Corentin. Bridges seized along the Murderet River. He rubbed his temples, exhausted already, and muttered to an aide, "This is not a raid. This is the beginning." Rommel himself was absent that night, celebrating his wife's birthday in Germany, convinced that poor weather would prevent any Allied attempt. In his absence, responsibility fell to men like Speidel, and they were rapidly realizing how unprepared they were. By dawn, more than 13,000 American paratroopers were on French soil. Many were disorganized, their units scattered. But they were also behind German lines, and that fact alone was devastating. Every road, every crossroad, every bridge could now be ambushed. German reinforcements rushing to the coast would find their paths blocked by small, determined groups of Americans who had no intention of retreating. At Corentin, Schaefer watched helplessly as one such group captured a vital crossroads, cutting his line of communication entirely. He tried to rally his men into a counterattack, but Allied aircraft already prowled overhead, strafing any column that dared to move in daylight. "This is madness," one of his officers muttered. "No," Schaefer replied grimly. "This is strategy." The paratroopers had not been sent to win a battle on their own. They had been sent to paralyze the German response. And they were succeeding. By the time Bretz and the men at Crisbecq opened fire on the fleet at dawn, the countryside behind them was already riddled with enemy soldiers. The Americans had cut telephone wires, blown bridges, and seized villages. They carried no heavy weapons, no tanks, no artillery, but they carried something far more dangerous: the ability to slow the German counterattack until the beaches were secure. As daylight spread across Normandy, Schaefer climbed onto the roof of his battered headquarters building. From there he could see the distant glow of naval bombardment lighting the horizon. The invasion fleet had arrived, unstoppable, inexhaustible. He shook his head slowly. "We prepared for divisions," he said aloud as if speaking to the morning air. "But what they have brought us is something else entirely. Factories." Entire factories turned into armies. At that same moment, far to the west, Bretz adjusted his rangefinder again. The ships filled the channel. The guns of the battery thundered once more, though he already suspected the truth, it would not matter. Behind him, in the fields and hedgerows, Schaefer and countless others were learning the same lesson. The Americans had come not as scattered raiders, but as the vanguard of an industrial storm. The rumble of guns was constant by the time dawn lifted the last shadows off the Normandy coast. At Weiterstandsnest 62, a strong point overlooking a stretch of beach soon to be known as Omaha, 19-year-old Gefreiter Lucas Hartmann tightened his grip on the grips of his MG-42. The weapon rested in its concrete embrasure, aimed at the empty sands below. He had never seen the ocean before being posted here months earlier. Now he couldn't see it at all. The channel was covered in ships. Big ones, small ones, fat-bellied transports, sleek destroyers darting back and forth. To Hartmann, it looked like every ship in the world had come to Normandy. His squad leader leaned close, shouting over the thunder outside, "Remember your fields of fire. Don't waste ammunition until they're close." Hartmann nodded, though his throat was dry. He had been told the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, that the Americans could never get past. But staring at the swarm of landing craft crawling toward the shore, he felt no certainty. Only dread. At 5:30 a.m. the bombardment began. It came first as a shriek in the sky, then as explosions that ripped the earth open. Naval shells crashed into the bluffs, smashing bunkers, pulverizing trenches, shattering barbed wire. Each impact shook the ground so violently that Hartmann's teeth rattled in his skull. Dust and smoke choked the air inside the bunker. Outside, the neat lines of obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, mines, were torn apart like toys. The beach convulsed under the rain of steel. Somewhere nearby, a shell landed directly on a bunker. The screams that followed rose above the gunfire, then were silenced in an instant as another explosion finished the job. Hartmann pressed himself against the cold concrete, praying for the barrage to pass. But it did not pass. It grew heavier, unrelenting, as if the very earth had turned against them. Then just after 6:30 a.m. the shelling lifted. Silence reigned for the briefest of moments, then the sea itself seemed to move. Landing craft surged forward, their ramps dropping with metallic clangs. Out spilled the first wave of Americans, hundreds of figures splashing into the surf. For an instant they looked small, fragile against the vastness of the beach. Hartmann's finger tightened on the trigger. Fire! His squad leader roared. The MG-42 came alive, its metallic scream tearing across the sand at 1,200 rounds per minute. The belt-fed weapon spat fire, tracers lancing into the ranks of men below. Soldiers collapsed in the surf, their helmets tumbling away, their bodies dragged by the waves. Others fell forward onto the sand, crimson spreading beneath them. Hartmann kept firing, adjusting his aim, sweeping across the mass of advancing figures. More machine guns joined in, their overlapping arcs creating a wall of death. Mortars thumped from hidden pits. Riflemen fired from loopholes. Omaha Beach became a killing ground. The Americans fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. Hartmann had never imagined such slaughter. He watched as men clung to obstacles for cover, only to be cut down. He saw bodies floating in the water, bumping against each other as the tide carried them in. Within minutes, the sand below turned dark with blood. For a terrible moment, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might actually hold. But Hartmann noticed something else. The Americans did not stop. For every man who fell, another surged forward. They crawled, they stumbled, they ran, always pressing closer. Groups clustered behind obstacles, then darted forward when the machine guns shifted away. Officers shouted, waving their men on despite the carnage. Hartmann's barrel glowed red-hot, the smell of burnt oil thick in his nostrils. His loader fed in another belt, hands shaking. "They won't stop," the boy muttered, eyes wide with horror. "Keep firing." Hartmann barked, though his own voice cracked. The sea kept delivering more. New waves of landing craft arrived, disgorging tanks, engineers, more infantry. Despite the maelstrom, the Americans refused to break. Their sheer persistence was unnerving, almost inhuman. At 8 a.m., a new sound joined the chaos, the thunder of naval guns, but closer now, far closer. Hartmann ducked instinctively as shells screamed overhead and detonated behind them. He risked a glance and felt his blood run cold. American destroyers had broken formation and were charging toward the beach. Great gray hulls loomed through the smoke, their decks bristling with guns. Hartmann could see sailors running across them, could almost feel their defiance. They came so close he could make out the names painted on their bows. McCook, Carmick, Doyle, Frankfurt. At point-blank range, their 5-inch guns opened fire. Concrete shattered. Bunkers that had survived the earlier bombardment now disintegrated under direct hits. Machine gun nests vanished in geysers of fire. Hartmann's position shook violently as a shell landed just meters away, cracking the embrasure, showering him with fragments of stone. He staggered back, ears ringing, eyes stinging from dust. Around him, men shouted, some in panic, others not at all. Through the smoke, Hartmann glimpsed the Americans again. They were no longer pinned at the waterline. Small groups had broken through, racing up the sand, using the craters as cover. Engineers cleared mines with Bangalore torpedoes, blowing gaps in the wire. Tanks crawled forward, their tracks grinding over obstacles. The wall was cracking. Hartmann clutched the grips of his MG-42 once more, firing into the chaos. But deep inside he knew the truth. This was not a battle they could win. Not against ships that treated destroyers as expendable, not against waves of soldiers backed by factories across the ocean. A mortar landed nearby, the shockwave hurling him against the concrete. His helmet clattered to the ground. Ears ringing, vision blurred, he forced himself upright, hands still searching for the grips of his gun. Below, the tide of men kept coming. The Atlantic wall was bleeding, but the invasion had not faltered. The enemy had too much, too many men, too many machines, too much of everything. Hartmann whispered hoarsely, not to his comrades, not even to himself, but to the roaring sea of steel and fire before him. You cannot be stopped. By mid-morning on June 6, Omaha Beach was a nightmare of fire and blood. Smoke hung low over the surf. Wrecked landing craft burned, their twisted hulls jutting from the tide like broken teeth. Dead and wounded men lay scattered across the sand, pinned behind obstacles and shallow craters. The German defenses were intact enough to make every step forward a massacre. From his flagship offshore, General Omar Bradley studied the scene through binoculars. Reports were grim. Some units annihilated, others trapped, progress stalled everywhere. If the situation did not change soon, he might face the unthinkable, ordering a withdrawal. Then, something happened that was not in any official plan. Aboard the destroyer USS McCook, Commander Edwin Hooper made a decision. The naval bombardment so far had been impressive, but at its distance, too inaccurate to silence the bunkers dominating the beach. Hooper understood what had to be done. He ordered his ship forward, directly toward Omaha Beach. His crew looked at him in disbelief. The shallow waters were full of mines, sandbars, and the threat of grounding. But Hooper did not flinch. "We're going in," he told his gunnery officer. "Those boys need us." The McCook's engines roared as she broke formation and steamed toward shore. She was soon followed by others, Carmick, Doyle, Frankfurt. The greyhounds of the fleet, destroyers built for speed and escort duty, were now charging into the most dangerous waters of the war. As they closed the distance, German gunners shifted fire, sending shells splashing around the advancing ships. One lucky hit could cripple them. But the destroyers pressed on, ignoring the storm. At less than 1,000 yards from the beach, point-blank range for their 5-inch guns, the destroyers wheeled broadside and opened fire. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Each blast from the McCook shook the deck like an earthquake. Her gunners had a clear line of sight to the strong points on the bluffs. Every time they fired, another German machine gun nest disappeared in a spray of concrete and flame. Bunkers that had resisted everything so far were now being dismantled brick by brick, hit after hit. The accuracy was uncanny. At such close range the ships could not miss. In his bunker at Widerstandsnest 62, Gefreiter Lucas Hartmann barely had time to react. The first shell landed meters away, collapsing part of the roof and filling the room with choking dust. He staggered to his gun, but another round followed, tearing a hole through the concrete wall. The MG-42 was buried in rubble before he could fire again. Hartmann and his loaders scrambled for the exit, ears ringing, lungs seared by the blast. Outside the world was chaos. The bluffs shook under the pounding. Bunkers erupted like volcanoes. Men screamed for medics, but few came. Hartmann realized with a jolt that their fortress was no longer a fortress. It was a coffin. From the decks of the destroyers, American sailors cheered as their shots tore the German defenses apart. Some crews were so close they claimed to see individual German soldiers fleeing between blasts. The USS Doyle turned her guns on a pillbox whose interlocking fields of fire had been slaughtering men of the 29th Infantry Division. The first salvo smashed the embrasure. The second collapsed the structure entirely. American infantry below, pinned for hours, now raised their rifles and advanced with renewed determination. One after another, the strong points fell silent. The destroyers had become floating artillery batteries, hurling shells as fast as their guns could cycle. Meanwhile, on the beach the impact was immediate. Soldiers of the 1st and 29th Divisions, who had been hugging the sand in despair, now saw the German fire slacken. Officers seized the moment. Engineers blasted gaps in the wire with Bangalore torpedoes. Infantry squads began pushing forward, moving from crater to crater. Sherman tanks, long delayed by obstacles, finally lumbered up the beach, their treads grinding over wreckage. Hartmann, dazed and bleeding from the ears, stumbled among the ruins of his shattered position. He could still hear the MG-42s chattering in the distance, but fewer now, much fewer. The destroyers had silenced many of them, and the ones that remained were running out of ammunition. He looked down at the beach and froze. The Americans were coming. Not in scattered groups now, but in a wave. Hundreds of them, moving with grim determination, covered by their own fire. Tanks rolled beside them, their guns blazing. Engineers carried flamethrowers and satchel charges. This was no longer a desperate trickle, it was an unstoppable tide. Hartmann thought of retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The exits were blown, the roads behind cut off by shelling. Above him, naval guns continued their merciless work. Concrete, once the pride of the Atlantic Wall, crumbled like sand. By 10 a.m., the German defense at Omaha was unraveling. The destroyers had broken the stalemate. Strong points were either obliterated or abandoned. American troops poured through the gaps, climbing the bluffs, flanking the remaining bunkers from behind. On board the McCook, Commander Hooper received word from shore observers, "Your fire is walking the troops up the hill." He smiled grimly. They had done it. The gamble had paid off. Later, veterans of Omaha would recall those destroyers with awe. Men who had crawled through hell remembered looking up and seeing the great gray shapes looming offshore, their guns flashing, shells screaming overhead. Some swore the ships had saved their lives. For the Germans, the memory was different. Survivors like Hartmann would later describe the destroyers with dread, calling them the hammers that smashed the wall. The Atlantic Wall had taken 4 years to build. In 4 hours, the destroyers had ripped it open. By noon, Omaha Beach, once on the verge of disaster, was secured enough for reinforcements to pour in. The cost had been staggering, thousands of American casualties. But the beachhead was established. The turning point had not come from careful planning or flawless execution. It had come from desperate courage, of destroyer captains who ignored the charts, drove into danger, and turned their warships into blunt instruments of survival. For the Germans who had believed in the invincibility of their fortifications, it was a revelation written in fire and smoke. Their concrete bunkers, their machine guns, their carefully prepared defenses, all had been helpless before the willpower and firepower of an enemy willing to risk everything. By the time the last strong points on Omaha Beach were collapsing under naval fire, a new rhythm had begun to dominate the shoreline. It was not the chaos of battle anymore, but something far more terrifying, the steady, mechanical pulse of Allied logistics at work. From the bluffs above, German survivors like Hartmann could only watch in numb astonishment. The landing craft kept coming, wave after wave, hour after hour. The channel itself seemed to be moving toward them, transformed into a living conveyor belt. First came the infantry, hundreds at a time, spilling from the ramps of Higgins' boats, wading through surf and smoke. Then came the vehicles, jeeps bouncing onto the sand, half-tracks grinding forward, bulldozers clearing wreckage with indifferent efficiency. And behind them came the real weight of the invasion, tanks. Shermans rolled ashore in groups, some wading directly through the shallows with snorkel attachments, others deposited by massive landing craft tank. The beach groaned under their treads as platoons of armor assembled in neat formation. For German defenders, it was a vision of nightmare arithmetic. Each tank they destroyed seemed instantly replaced by 2 more. Each wave of men followed by another, fresher wave. The defenders' rifles grew hot, their machine guns ran dry, their artillery dwindled, but the Allies kept coming, inexhaustible, as if the sea itself was birthing soldiers. Aboard a forward observation post inland, Captain Dieter Kappel of the 352nd Infantry Division tried to calculate the scale of what he was seeing. He had studied war his entire life. He had fought in Russia, where German divisions faced overwhelming Soviet numbers. But this was different. "This isn't war," he muttered to his adjutant. "It's industry." Kappel scribbled in his notebook, landing craft types, silhouettes of ships, approximate counts. His figures soon grew absurd. By noon, he estimated, the Allies had landed more vehicles on a single beach than his entire corps possessed. By dusk, they would surpass the total armored strength of the entire 7th Army. What shocked him most was not just the quantity but the precision. Every few minutes, another flotilla arrived, perfectly on schedule. Landing craft that had discharged their men turned back to sea, only to be replaced instantly by others. Bulldozers carved access roads through the dunes. Engineers laid down steel matting to prevent vehicles from bogging in the sand. By afternoon, Supply trucks were driving directly from ship to shoreline, unloading ammunition, fuel and food into orderly stockpiles. From a German vantage point, it looked less like an invasion and more like the construction of a city. One soldier later wrote, "We had thought they would land men then pause to regroup. Instead they landed an army, then another behind it, then the foundations of an entire country." It was not an attack. It was a civilization moving onto the shore. Among the most shocking sights were the amphibious vehicles. Dukus, ungainly six-wheeled trucks fitted with propellers, chugged ashore in the thousands. They carried artillery pieces, crates of rations, drums of fuel, even stacks of ammunition. When they reached dry sand, they shifted gears and drove inland like ordinary trucks. German soldiers who first saw them could hardly believe their eyes. Machines that swam and drove? It felt like science fiction. Then there were the landing ship tanks, the behemoths of the fleet. At over 300 feet long, these monsters grounded themselves deliberately on the sand. Their massive bow doors opened with a groan, and out poured not a handful of men, but entire armored companies. German officers watching through binoculars could only shake their heads. In one afternoon, the Allies had brought ashore more tanks than Rommel had commanded in North Africa. The transformation of the beaches was relentless. Where in the morning there had been chaos, burning wrecks, dead men, craters, by late afternoon order reigned. Engineers had cleared obstacles, flagged safe lanes through the mines, and established traffic control points. Shore parties directed jeeps left, tanks right, trucks straight inland. Within hours, what had been killing grounds were functioning highways. Hartmann, crouched among the ruins of his shattered bunker, realized with despair that every German assumption had been wrong. They had prepared to repel a raid, a daring strike at best. What stood before him now was not a raid, not even a conventional invasion. It was something entirely new, industrial war on a scale his generation had never imagined. Back at 7th Army headquarters, telephone lines buzzed with frantic reports. One colonel described the beachhead as a wound that bleeds soldiers. Another, more candid, reported to higher command, "The sea itself is attacking us." Rommel, still absent in Germany, had warned of this very danger. He had begged for tanks to be stationed closer to the coast, for more mines, for greater depth in the defenses. But the high command had dismissed his fears, convinced the Allies could never land such a force. Now his warnings echoed like prophecy. By nightfall, the impossible statistics were reality. Over 150,000 men ashore. Thousands of vehicles. Entire tank battalions. Stockpiles of supplies that already dwarfed the daily consumption of German divisions. And all of it protected by battleships offshore and aircraft overhead. Hartmann, exhausted and broken, slumped against the wall of his ruined bunker. Around him, the last survivors of his unit tried to regroup. But there was no plan left, no chance of counterattack. Through the smoke and twilight, he saw more ships approaching, their silhouettes black against the fading horizon. The conveyor belt had not stopped. It would not stop tomorrow. It would not stop the next day. The realization sank into his bones like ice. This was not just the loss of a battle. It was the unveiling of a new kind of war, one where factories mattered more than fortresses, where supply chains were deadlier than machine guns. The Germans had believed they were ready for anything. What they faced instead was the Industrial Revolution itself, marching ashore behind a wall of steel. On the morning of June 7th, German reconnaissance aircraft flew over the Normandy coast, cameras clicking as they captured the aftermath of D-Day. The photographs were rushed back to headquarters, where intelligence officers crowded around light tables to study them. What they saw left them speechless. The Allies were not merely unloading troops and vehicles. They were building ports. At first, German officers refused to believe the images. Huge floating structures extended out from the beaches like mechanical arms. Concrete blocks the size of houses, known as phoenix caissons, had been towed across the channel and sunk deliberately to form breakwaters. Old ships, some of them First World War relics, had been scuttled in neat lines to form protective barriers. From these breakwaters stretched roadways of steel and timber, floating on pontoons, leading out to massive jetties where ships were already unloading. It was the most audacious engineering feat the war had yet seen, the Mulberry Harbors. While the German High Command had obsessed over defending ports like Cherbourg and Le Havre, the Allies had sidestepped the problem entirely. Why seize a port at all when you could build one? At Allied headquarters, the idea had seemed insane when first proposed. Tow an entire harbor across the channel, piece by piece, then assemble it under fire on enemy shores. Yet on June 7, the impossible was reality. Within days, the mulberries were fully operational, capable of handling thousands of tons of supplies per day. To the Germans who had spent 4 years fortifying the Atlantic Wall, the realization was crushing. They had believed the war would hinge on holding key ports. Now ports were irrelevant. Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, later admitted in his memoir, "It was as if the Allies had rewritten the rules of war. We prepared to fight geography itself and they abolished geography." 4 men like Hartmann, crouched in shattered bunkers near Omaha, the change was visible even without binoculars. The coastline itself was transforming. Where once there had been empty beaches, there were now piers, cranes, trucks, bulldozers, and endless stockpiles of fuel and ammunition. The beaches of Normandy had become industrial zones, buzzing with activity day and night. The mulberries were not just impressive, they were decisive. By the second week of June, one harbor was unloading 9,000 tons of supplies every single day, more than many French ports had ever handled in peacetime. Ammunition, fuel, medical equipment, tanks, trucks, artillery, all flowed ashore in a torrent that no German counterattack could possibly interrupt. And if that were not enough, the Allies unveiled another marvel: Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. Fuel, the lifeblood of modern war, was pumped directly across the channel through flexible pipelines laid on the seabed. German intelligence had no idea such a project even existed. For German officers trying to make sense of this industrial storm, the psychological impact was devastating. Colonel Karl-Heinz Groth, stationed near Cannes, summed up the despair in a report to higher command: "We are fighting not an army but an economic system. Every day their strength increases. Every day ours decreases. The longer we fight, the worse our position becomes." Rommel himself, returning from Germany to inspect the front, was stunned by what he saw. The beaches were no longer battlefields, they were construction sites feeding an invasion that grew stronger by the hour. He reported to Berlin that the situation was hopeless without immediate reinforcement. Hitler refused to listen. As the mulberries rose, so too did the Allied confidence. Commanders who had feared the worst on June 6 now saw the future clearly. Normandy was secure. The Atlantic Wall was breached. The logistical engine was roaring at full speed. Nothing short of a miracle could stop it. For the German soldiers still holding the line inland, the realization came slowly but relentlessly. Each day the sound of ships unloading supplies never ceased. Each night, fresh waves of men and vehicles rolled inland. Every attempt at counterattack was met not only with determined infantry and tanks, but with artillery that seemed limitless and aircraft that darkened the skies. One young officer, writing in his diary near Corentin, captured the despair. "It is like trying to stop a river with one's hands. We kill them, more come. We destroy their vehicles, more arrive. Their machines never stop. The ocean itself seems to deliver them." By late June, the numbers were beyond comprehension. Hundreds of thousands of men ashore. Tens of thousands of vehicles. Hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. The mulberry harbors, battered by storms but constantly repaired, continued their work without pause. German attempts to strike them failed. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a shadow of its former self, could only mount token raids. Submarines tried and failed to penetrate the wall of escorts. Artillery fire fell short. The mulberries were untouchable, guarded by battleships and the vast Allied air armada. Hartmann, now a prisoner of war after being captured in a hedgerow skirmish, would later tell his interrogators, "When I saw those harbors, I knew the war was lost. It was not soldiers we faced but engineers. Not tactics but mathematics." Against such power, courage meant nothing. For the German high command, denial could not last. Reports poured in. Divisions shattered, reserves committed piecemeal, counterattacks annihilated by naval gunfire and aircraft. The mulberries kept growing. The Allied beachhead expanded. The trickle of supplies became a flood. The Atlantic Wall, the pride of Hitler's strategy, had not simply been broken. It had been made irrelevant. By the end of June 1944, the beaches of Normandy no longer resembled battlefields. They looked instead like ports, highways, and construction sites. Mountains of ammunition stood in neat stacks. Fuel drums lined the sands in endless rows. Convoys of trucks rolled inland, their headlights blacked out against air attack that never came. For the German defenders, the transformation was unbearable to witness. Only weeks earlier they had believed the Atlantic Wall could hold indefinitely. Now they saw that their vaunted fortifications had been brushed aside like sandcastles before the tide. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the veteran commander of the Western Front, was summoned by Hitler and asked why the invasion had not been repelled. His answer was blunt: "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" For his honesty he was promptly dismissed. The German High Command still clung to fantasies of counterattack. Panzer divisions were ordered forward, their crews grimly determined to repeat the victories of 1940. But Normandy was not France of 4 years before. Every daylight movement was spotted by Allied reconnaissance planes. Every armored column was savaged by rocket-firing typhoons and bomb-laden thunderbolts. Every counterattack broke apart under barrages from battleships offshore. Colonel General Hans Eberbach, tasked with leading armored reserves, described the experience bitterly. "It was not a battle but an execution. We were shelled from sea, bombed from air, and attacked by tanks as numerous as ants. The enemy was everywhere and we could move nowhere." By mid-July the statistics were staggering. The Allies had landed over 1 million men, 500,000 vehicles and millions of tons of supplies. German losses mounted daily. Entire divisions were reduced to shadows. The 12th SS Panzer Division, once the pride of Hitler's forces, entered Normandy with over 20,000 men. By August, fewer than 1,000 remained combat effective. Even the most fanatical officers could see the truth. Courage, discipline, even tactical skill were meaningless against such overwhelming material superiority. The Reich was being ground down not by better soldiers, but by factories an ocean away. Hartmann, the young infantryman captured after Omaha, heard the despair in his interrogators' voices as they described their supply lines. To his astonishment, they spoke not of shortages but of abundance. Ammunition was limitless. Trucks were disposable. If a bridge was destroyed, engineers built another overnight. "You Germans measure your strength in divisions," one American major told him. "We measure ours in production lines." The lesson could not have been clearer. In late July, Operation Cobra shattered the German front. Allied bombers unleashed thousands of tons of explosives in a concentrated carpet, annihilating panzer divisions where they stood. Survivors stumbled out of craters, deaf, burned, broken, not defeated by enemy infantry but erased by machines. From there the collapse was swift. Falaise became a slaughterhouse with tens of thousands of Germans killed or captured. Retreating units abandoned tanks for lack of fuel, trucks for lack of spare parts, artillery for lack of horses. The German army in France disintegrated, not from lack of courage, but from the weight of numbers and firepower it could never match. The officers who survived were scarred not just physically but psychologically. Many had grown up believing in German superiority, in the myth of an invincible Wehrmacht, in the idea that the Allies were too soft, too divided, too weak to fight effectively. Normandy destroyed those illusions forever. At a symposium a decade later, German generals admitted the bitter truth. One declared, "We were not defeated by better strategy. We were defeated by arithmetic. We counted battalions. They counted factories. We measured courage. They measured production." Against such mathematics there was no answer. For men like Hartmann the memory never faded. Decades later he stood again on the bluffs overlooking Omaha. The beach was quiet now, tourists strolling where once blood had stained the sand. He remembered the morning when the horizon vanished under ships, when destroyers roared into shore, when the sea itself seemed to rise up and steel against him. He told his grandson standing beside him, "We thought we were ready. We had our bunkers, our machine guns, our courage. But we were wrong. War was no longer about soldiers alone. That morning I saw the future. It was not German. It was industrial." On June 6, 1944, the German officers who looked out across the English Channel did not just witness an invasion. They witnessed the birth of modern warfare, where factories mattered more than fortresses, where supply lines mattered more than slogans, where the outcome was not decided by valor, but by production. They had prepared to fight armies. What they faced was industry itself. The invasion fleet of nearly 7,000 ships was more than a military operation. It was a message written in steel across the Channel. The age of industrial war had arrived and Germany with all its soldiers and slogans, could never hope to stand against it. The Reich had promised 1,000 years. On the beaches of Normandy, its officers understood the truth: it would not survive the summer.